Hi, this is Patrick from LSAT Lab. We're talking about role questions in the logical reasoning section. Role questions are about 4% of logical reasoning, so if you're doing a classic LSAT with 2 LR sections, you'll get somewhere between 1 and 3 of these. If you're doing a flex test, you'll probably just get 1, maybe 2. What we're going to talk about is how to spot one, how we recognize that question stem. We're going to talk about what different roles there are in an argument. What are the possibilities for these answer choices? We'll rehearse the process of breaking down arguments to try to figure out what role everything is playing. And then we'll dissect the answer choices to try to figure out why the trap answers are wrong. The most common keyword that we'll see in these question stems is role. The other noteworthy feature is that the question stem will actually contain an excerpt from the argument itself. This is the only question stem generally that would quote a claim from the paragraph. So these question stems will tend to be longer than other ones. We usually start at the question stem when we see, we're doing a role question. And they're asking me about the statement, the general public is better traveled today than in the past. Okay, I got to remember that. You really don't. In fact, the opposite. Most of us would say, don't even worry about what statement is actually being quoted. As soon as you realize you're doing a role question, your job is to go read that argument, find the conclusion, find the evidence. We'll worry later about which claim they asked us about. Here's another question stem. This time, instead of saying, what role does the claim play, they said, the claim figures in the argument in which one of the following ways. Pretty awkward phrasing. They don't use that much, but they do sometimes say, how does it figure? How does it figure in the argument? Kind of an unlikely colloquialism, LSAC. And once again, we see in the blue that they're quoting some claim from the paragraph. Last one. Instead of saying, what role does this claim play? They say, what function does this statement have? The statement functions in what way? So my advice would be to keep it simple on the front end. All I'm ever trying to do after I've read the argument before I go to answer choices is say to myself, was this the conclusion? Was it part of the support? Was it something oppositional? Or was it just neutral? The process for doing a role question is to first and foremost find the conclusion. And then we'll relate everything else to that conclusion. Does it support it? Does it oppose it? Or is it neutral? When we anticipate what we want, we're mainly just starting off with that fuzzy sense of conclusion, support, opposing, or neutral. And then once we get into the answers, we'll have to potentially consider some more nuances and details. All right, so what are the available roles? In its simplest terms, the 4 available roles are you either are the main conclusion, you're something supporting that conclusion, you're something kind of opposing that conclusion, or you're just neutral in relation to that conclusion. If we wanted to get a little bit more granular, then we could say, all right, well, there's 2 types of supporting ideas. You can call something a premise, or you can call something an intermediate conclusion, a subsidiary conclusion, and we'll talk more later about what those mean. And when it comes to the opposing ideas, is it an opposing conclusion or is it an opposing premise? Or is the author herself just sort of making a concession, acknowledging something to the opposition? So what roles do these claims end up playing? Well, they only end up testing us on the main conclusion about 14% of the time. They try to make the conclusion harder to find than average. You're less likely on a role question to see the last sentence be the conclusion. When you're doing main conclusion or role questions, LSAT knows that your primary job is to find the conclusion, so they try to be a little bit trickier about hiding it. The most common ingredient to be asked about is some part of the support. And usually it is just a premise, but a healthy amount of time it is going to be an intermediate subsidiary conclusion. Generally speaking, when LSAT experts are doing a role question, they are priming their brain to be on the lookout for intermediate conclusions, because we know that this sneaky little ingredient is more likely to matter on this type of question than on any other. 14% of the time, they're going to be testing something that goes against the author. Either something she acknowledges, such as, although some facts are okay, or something that her opponent has brought up. And then very rarely will they test us on something that has no real relationship to the conclusion, something that's just neutral background. Here are some answer choices from a role question. And on the left, we're reminding you of the 6 main roles that are up for grabs. Pause the recording and think about, for each answer choice, which role does it seem to be describing? You may have to use a role more than once. Okay, welcome back. A says that this claim has been used to support a conclusion. So that is definitely a premise. B says that this claim is offered to call into question some other claim. You would have to interpret B as, this is our author trying to undermine someone else's position. We could potentially call that our author's premise, because our author will apparently be refuting someone or rebutting them, and this is their reason why. C says that this claim is just supposed to introduce the topic. It doesn't play any logical role, so that would mean it's totally neutral, some sort of background claim. D, of course, says it is a premise. So if we were trying to choose between A and D, what we'd really be tested on is, what is the main conclusion? Is it what A says, that people should live in large cities? Or is the main conclusion what D says, that large cities are generally more polluted than the countryside? E says that this claim is what the whole argument is trying to establish. So that, of course, means the main conclusion. If you struggled with any of these, consider writing the answer choice on the front of a flashcard and testing yourself on what role is this playing, and then put the answer on the back of that flashcard. So my advice would be to keep it simple on the front end. Go ahead and pause the recording, try this problem, give yourself about 1.5 minutes if you want to keep it official. And when you unpause, we'll discuss. Welcome back. The question stem, of course, says, what role does this claim play? When we look at the argument, I'm always hunting for keywords to make this a little bit easier. I do see thus. So the last sentence is definitely a conclusion. But this is a role question, so I know there are these sneaky things called intermediate subsidiary conclusions. I'm not going to just assume that is my main conclusion yet, but it is a conclusion. Anything that is a conclusion has some support offered. So we could read that sentence that says, people in large cities make less pollution than people in small towns, rural areas, and ask ourselves, well, why should we believe that? And if you're using a connector like thus, therefore, so, it means that the claim right beforehand was part of the support. It might be the entirety of the support, but the claim beforehand definitely led into it. Let's think about the previous claim. Why is it that people in large cities make less pollution than people in smaller towns? Oh, because city folk are more likely to use mass transit, so you don't have all their cars polluting. And then they have energy efficient homes. So we're not wasting as much energy or water, I guess, with their dwellings. Okay, so now maybe that's the conclusion in the premise. Let me think about this first sentence. When we see the word although begins that first sentence, we know we're going to get a 2-part idea. The 2 parts are going to contrast. But we also know that the second part is the one that matters more to the author. Although is used as a way to introduce like a concession or something that goes against what we're ultimately going to say. So that first idea is that large cities are generally more polluted than the countryside. And yet, I'm going to go a different direction here. Increasing urbanization would reduce pollution nationwide. So I know my author cares more about the second idea, that purple idea. Is it a fact or an opinion? Increasing urbanization may actually reduce the total amount of pollution. Because of that wording, it may actually, and because it's a prediction, doing this may bring about that. This is an opinion, which makes me start wondering, is this my author's conclusion, or is this, one of my author's conclusions? So let's compare it to the red, which we knew was a conclusion. First of all, we can just ask ourselves, are these fact or opinion? Because conclusions have to sort of be opinions, and they have to be supported. So occasionally when we're comparing two ideas, we might realize, oh, one of these is kind of a fact, so that's not going to be the author's conclusion. But when I look at these ideas, they are both opinions. They're both future tense. Increasing urbanization might actually reduce pollution. And then the last sentence was saying, a given number of people in a large city will make less pollution than that same number of people in a small, dispersed town. Maybe the second one feels a little more factual, but it is still posed as sort of a hypothetical, and so I wouldn't quite consider that factual. So I'm not being let off the hook here. They both feel like opinions. What I need to do now is ask myself, which one is support for the other? So what I would do is I would take each claim, and then I would pose the question, well, why should I believe that? And see if the other claim felt like an answer. So we'll try it with the one on the left. Increasing urbanization might actually reduce nationwide pollution. Well, why should we believe that? Because a given number of people in cities makes less pollution than that same number of people in small rural towns. Okay, did the red sound like a reason for the purple? Yeah, it's saying the more city-like our living is, the more urban our living, the less pollution, because the same number of people make less pollution in a city setting than in a rural setting. So I think red supports purple, but I'll try it the other way. What if I said red? A given number of people in large cities make less pollution than the same number of people in small towns. Okay, why should I believe that a given number of people in cities are less polluting than those same people in small towns? Well, because increasing urbanization might actually reduce pollution. That doesn't seem to make sense at all. The reason that people in cities pollute less than people in small towns was that blue claim, that people in cities are more likely to use mass transit and have an energy-efficient home. So comparing which one feels like it's support for the other helps us realize the hierarchy of ideas here. If we were to look at this whole argument, we would see, we start with that counterpoint that I know what you're thinking. Large cities generally more polluted than the pristine countryside. But are you ready for this provocative main conclusion? I think increasing urbanization would actually reduce pollution. Why do I believe that? Because people in cities make less pollution per capita than people in small towns. And why do they? Well, because they're more likely to use mass transit and have energy efficient homes. So we had a counterpoint, our main conclusion. The intermediate conclusion is the very last claim, and then the premise was the blue. One thing that will help us work a little harder to find that is our awareness that on role and on main conclusion questions, they're going to purposefully mess with us in terms of hiding the conclusion. They're usually not going to give it to us in the last sentence with an obvious keyword. Most arguments on role and main conclusion are upside down. The conclusion comes earlier than the support comes. And a lot of them are rebuttal style, meaning they are really fighting somebody else's position. And many of them have intermediate conclusions. These are sort of the three tricks LSAT has up its sleeve if it's trying to complicate the process of finding the conclusion. All right, so we know what role everything plays. Let's look at our question stem and see which one they're asking us about. They're asking us about increasing urbanization may actually reduce. Okay, they're asking us about the second claim, which was our main conclusion. So let's go to the answers and try to find something that sounds like main conclusion. I'm normally taking a quick first glance at the beginning of every answer choice to see if it already gives away that it has the wrong role. Remember, I want the main conclusion. So if I see it's used to support, that sounds like premise. It's offered to call something into question. Maybe, only if this conclusion were actually rebutting someone, could you call a conclusion an idea that's trying to call something into question. But there's no person in this paragraph that our author is arguing with. C is saying it's just trying to introduce the topic. It plays no logical role. What are you talking about? It plays the ultimate logical role. It's the main conclusion. And of course, D just gives it to you right away. It's a premise. No, it's not. So we know right away that it's going to be E. A and D advertise that we're talking about a premise. B is saying that it's attacking a view, but there are no other views present in this paragraph, and it's certainly not background. Let's confirm that we like E. It is using that terminology we talked about before. The argument is designed to establish its conclusion. So anytime we see that phrasing, it'll be referring to the main conclusion. So the correct answer is E. You may notice that we had to think a lot up front to make sure we understood the argument correctly, but we were able to move relatively swiftly through analyzing the answer choices. Roll questions swing pretty dramatically from one side of the difficulty spectrum to the other. Some of them are so easy that you could be in and out in 45 seconds. They're asking you for conclusion, you go find the answer choice that says conclusion, you're done. Other roll questions can be some of the hardest because the answer choices can actually avoid classic terminology and use a lot of abstract relational language that you really have to think about and parse bit by bit to figure out whether or not it matches. Let's take a look at another one. Pause the recording, try this one on your own, and when you unpause it, we'll talk about it. Okay, welcome back. This time the question stem said, this reference played which of the following roles in the argument? So let's go find that conclusion. If I'm scanning around for keywords, what would stick out to my brain are three things. First, we have this familiar setup. It's now commonly said that, but many people think, however, a lot of people believe, and yet, which is this style of ascribing a belief to other people and then using some sort of but, yet, however pivot to start a rebuttal. And remember, if this is our flashcard from before, when we're doing roll or main conclusion, it's very, very common that the argument is rebuttal style or that the conclusion is higher than the evidence, or both. A rebuttal style argument comes in two different forms. The but, yet, however, tells you that we're switching now from somebody else's point of view to our author's voice, but that doesn't actually tell you that you're hearing the author's conclusion. Maybe, maybe not. Look at this cheesy basketball example. Some people say LeBron is better than Kobe, but they're wrong. After all, Kobe won more championships. In this case, I start with the ascription, some people say, my counterpoint, and then I pivot into my conclusion, but they're wrong. The sentiment that sounds like they're wrong, but I disagree, but they've overlooked something important. That is going to be your conclusion. And then the author's going to have to back that up with why are they wrong? Well, because Kobe won more titles. But you can actually do the same argument in a slightly different order. So consider this twist. Some people say LeBron is better than Kobe, same start, but Kobe won more championships, so they're wrong. So I just took the last two ideas and flipped them. When we see a but, yet, however rebuttal, we don't know whether we're going to hear the conclusion and then support, or whether we're going to hear support for an eventual conclusion. But if you notice, we still have keywords. After all signals that that last idea is a premise, and so signals that the last idea is a conclusion. So if I had noticed that I'm reading a rebuttal argument here on question 11, I would start looking for keywords connecting those last two claims to see if I could make it even easier on my brain to figure out which is the premise, which is the conclusion. And they're giving us the word so, which is telling me that the last claim is my author's conclusion. And there's only one claim left, so apparently the but claim is going to have to be my author's evidence or support. So if we're thinking about the argument from a big picture, we have the opposing point saying that these new styles of media are corroding our intellects. Our author is saying, I don't know about corroding or devolving, it's just changing. And what's my evidence for that? Why should we believe that? Well, this sort of thing happens, A few hundred years ago when books were invented, people were scared of that. People were scared of rock and roll when the Beatles came to town. But we adapted. Okay, so we know our structure. We started with an opposing position. We got our author's evidence or premise, and then we ended with our author's conclusion. Let's take a look at that question stem and find out which of those three we were being asked about. We were being asked about the middle, the second claim, which was the author's premise. Because this is a rebuttal style argument, though, we could cast that in two different ways. We could say, it's evidence for our author's conclusion, the red claim at the bottom. Or you could say that it's evidence against the green claim up top. When we look at our answer choices here, again, we want to take a quick glance at the initial noun or phrase that starts an answer to see if it even seems like it's on the right wavelength of evidence support. And ooh, no luck there. Evidence, illustration of, example of, evidence, evidence. Those all are worth reading because they all sound like they could mean a premise. So we don't get any easy eliminations this time. If we look at A, it should be saying that this is evidence for the final sentence. It's evidence for the idea that the human mind is just changing, not devolving. But instead, A is saying that it's supporting the first claim, the opposing point. Well, it's not supporting that, it's opposing that. Remember, our prephrase is saying it's evidence against the first sentence. This answer is saying it's evidence supporting the first sentence. So this is the opposite of what's going on. Choice B says that it's an illustration of a general hypothesis. Ugh, is there a general hypothesis happening? Is somebody here saying that intellectual abilities are inseparable from the means by which we communicate? That doesn't sound like my author. My author seems to say, who cares about how we communicate? A few hundred years ago, they were worried about books. Now they're worried about email and electronic media. He seems to think our intellectual abilities are okay. They're not devolving. It's just changing how we communicate. If the second half of B had said that it's an illustration of the general hypothesis that our brains are just changing, not devolving, I could live with the first half of B. But as we see a lot of times in Roll, it'll correctly say that something is a premise, but it will incorrectly identify what conclusion it's there to support. All right, if we look at C, is it an example of a cultural change? Well, we were talking about several centuries ago when the spread of literacy was sort of threatening oral culture. So I guess I'm on board. Yeah, it's a cultural change. Are we saying it didn't necessarily have a detrimental effect on the human mind overall? This is weird, but I'm trying to look at my conclusion and think, does that kind of match? Is our author's conclusion saying that electronic media isn't going to necessarily have a detrimental effect on the human mind? Yeah, I can make that work. There's a lot of keyword similarities. Change and alteration mean the same. Isn't having a detrimental effect is a good match for it's not devolving. And of course, we are talking about the human mind both times. So C feels okay. I'm not convinced it's my answer at this point, but I would feel like, well, it got the role correct. It is support. It's an example. And it is pointing at the correct conclusion because it's trying to paraphrase the last sentence. Let's keep it. D is a very tempting answer. The initial position that we're arguing against was that electronic media is corroding the intellectual skills that literary media used to require and promote. And D is saying that this premise, this middle claim, is our author's evidence that those first people are wrong. The intellectual skills aren't being lost. That's an unwarranted claim. Is our author arguing that the skills required and fostered by literary media aren't being lost? It actually seems like in her conclusion, she's acknowledging they are being lost. The human mind is being altered, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just an alteration. It's not a devolution. The first claim was that electronic media has corroded our intellectual skills. Our author would probably disagree with that and say, whoa, 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 that's a little unwarranted. It's not corroding our intellect. It's just changing it. But our author probably does acknowledge that electronic media doesn't require the same sort of intellectual skills as literary media. That's why she's saying, we went from an oral culture to a book culture. Now we're going from a book culture to an electronic media culture. Yeah, we're altering the human mind again, but it's not a devolution. So D is tricky. Our author would probably say that, yes, it's warranted to say that the literary media skills are being lost. but it's not a bad thing. Luckily, E is much easier to get rid of. It says that this is possible evidence that then gets dismissed by our author, and that doesn't make any sense. Our author is leaning on this. This is her only premise. She's not dismissing this premise. If we think about what it came down to get this one right, this one seemed very hard. C versus D is probably where we would have been stuck. And what we're really doing at that point is comparing language to the conclusion. Is our author's conclusion saying, those literary skills aren't being lost? Or is our author saying, yeah, we're changing, but it's not necessarily detrimental? So be prepared on a role question to really end up being tested on the conclusion, because a lot of these down to 2 moments will really center on which one provides a better fit for the wording in the conclusion. All right, so recapping, how do we know we're doing a role question? Most common keyword would be role, but occasionally you'll see a phrasing like, how does this statement figure in the argument? How does this statement function? The other thing that gives away a role question stem is that some claim from the paragraph is actually quoted in the question stem. What are the roles we're considering? At their most simplest, we're just thinking conclusion, support, opposing, or neutral. If we want to get more nuanced, we can try to divide up the 2 types of support or the 2 types of opposing, but I would not worry about that until an answer choice makes me worry about that. What kind of trap answers are we likely to see? Since so many of these problems test premise, about 40% of them, we'll see a lot of answers that get the premise part of it right, but incorrectly describe what conclusion it's there to support. Some of these answers had a term or a direction that was just opposite of what the claim was actually doing. Like when we were rebutting that first sentence, we saw a claim that said, oh, this is a premise that supports the first sentence. And we thought, no, it opposes the first sentence. And then we can see some answers that are too strong, such as, it was too strong to say, the idea that we're losing our literary skills is unwarranted. Because our author was actually acknowledging, yeah, we are losing them, but it's an alteration. It's not a devolution. Thanks for joining us to talk about role questions. Please feel free to check out some of our other videos or visit us at lsatlab.com.